So this week we're going to be talking about Heidegger on technology. The main text that we're going to use is the question concerning technology, the essay which you have available on your resources. And just to quickly recap on what we did last week, we spoke a little bit more about the nature of art. We talked about the difference between aesthetics and art, and we talked about how art might be a response to nihilism. Now, it's important to try and understand that when we're talking about technology with Heidegger, the discourse on the question of art is still very much present. So some of the insights that Heidegger talked about when he was talking about art are also relevant to his discourse on technology. And I'll try and explain that a little bit as I go. Primarily, the discourse on art relates to the question of nihilism, because with the question of technology, Heidegger is also, so last week we talked about the question of art, and the idea was that art is one of the ways we can respond to the question of nihilism. The other thing we need to do when thinking about nihilism is to understand how technology affects nihilism, or how nihilism is a contributor, I suppose, to the construction of nihilism, or a very specific account of technology. Now, what we need to try and understand is that with Heidegger, he's trying to question how technology relates to thinking. And I suppose with Heidegger there was a useful enough opposition between technology and modern technology, although modern technology is a very broad term. But I suppose Heidegger is not anti-technological per se. He just thinks that we need to reshape or rethink our relationship with technology, and specifically modern technology. And what I mean roughly by modern technology is, I suppose, the acceleration of our use of technology from the industrial period onwards, and all of the attendant developments and innovations that have emerged through capitalist economies with technology. Now, this week then, just to give you a structure of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about some very specific questions. Now, the question concerning technology essay is very, 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 very difficult, and it's quite abstract. But we'll work it through in the seminar. And what I'm going to try and do is try and focus on some of the key features of the essay. So I'm going to talk about what Heidegger means by Tecna and poiesis. That's an important dimension of the essay. So if you're answering a question, say on technology, you will need to include information on both Tecna and poiesis, and how Heidegger thinks that Tecna and poiesis are in some way divorced. I'm going to talk a little bit about Aristotle. I'm going to have to talk about Aristotle because Aristotle's theory of the four causes in Aristotle's metaphysics relate very much to the essay concerning the question concerning technology. I'm going to talk about then after that the essential features of how Heidegger understands technology, and how modern technology has the capacity to transform the ways we think in nihilistic ways. And I have a question there: only God can still save us. Well, I suppose the thing there is, at the end of his life, Heidegger famously, in an interview with Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, said only a God can still save us. And I suppose that's a rather pessimistic view. In a sense, he's kind of saying there that we're a little bit screwed, that the fast-paced acceleration and proliferation of modern technological devices will ultimately be destructive for us. Now, however, he's pessimistic, but he does think that there is we have a saving power, or we can, if we transform the ways we think, we can confront this question of nihilism. And at the end of the lecture, I'm going to talk about a little bit about how Heidegger conceives of his well, maybe not an alternative, I suppose, but how Heidegger gives us a pathway to alternative forms of thinking that are not dominated by the types of thinking that we get with modern Technology. Now, to begin, I want to talk about the Aristotle's four causes, as these are important for understanding what Heidegger is talking about. Now, Aristotle in his Metaphysics, so Aristotle's metaphysics is, I suppose, his study of nature, what we would now call science. And for Aristotle, he says that with the four causes, or I suppose you could call them the four explanations, or the four reasons, what he's giving us is an explanation for why anything comes to be, why anything can come about, or in another sense, it's a theory of change. What are the essential and accidental, or the necessary and sufficient conditions of for making a change come about? Okay, and Aristotle breaks this into four causes. Now, this is, I guess, quite counterintuitive to how we might think of causation. Normally, when we think of causation now, we think of, I don't know, like so David Hume talks about one billiard ball hitting another. So A hits B and causes C to happen. And that is definitely important, but Aristotle thinks that causation is a bit more multi-layered than that, and he gives us four causes that have to be there for any object or thing to be the thing it is. So firstly, we have the material cause. Now, the material cause is the stuff. It's the physical properties. It's the material which is required to make an object what it is. So that's easy enough to think about, I think. So the material cause would be, say, something like wood. So say if you've got a wooden chair, the wood would be the material cause. It would be the stuff that makes up the chair. Second one is the efficient cause. Now, the efficient cause it's important. This will be important for Heidegger. So the efficient cause, I suppose, would be, in other sense, be the instrumental cause. So, like if you're a sculptor and you are, working with some stone material. Easily see, don't know much about sculpting, but say you're looking at stone material and you're shaping it with a hammer and a chisel. So say the chisel would be the efficient cause, which shapes the object into what it is supposed to become. I think one thing to think about with the efficient cause, and it will be important for Heidegger, is that the efficient cause implies a temporal designation. So there's a before and after, or a sequence of events. So the efficient cause is, I don't know, white pool ball hits black pool ball, right? So one has to happen prior to the other in order for an outcome to take place. Now, what's important about this for Heidegger is that this is the type of causality that governs scientific thinking and scientific activity. The efficient cause is also, I suppose, how we think about causality in our everyday life now. I suppose the other thing that we need to think about with the efficient cause is that, well, I suppose that with the efficient cause, what you need to think about is the ways in which an object can become something or cannot become something. All right, and what Heidegger is thinking with modern technology, the efficient cause becomes becomes all-consuming. Right, we have obscured the other causes and we've forgotten them in a sense. And I suppose the example of that could be straightforward enough. So, for example, you could think, like, say this morning, say I had some porridge for breakfast, but the idea was that there was no sense that I had any knowledge or thought or consideration of the genesis of that bowl of porridge. I don't know where the bowl came from. I don't know what it was made from. I didn't even think about the material. So in a sense, all of that is removed from the object. Now, the next cause is perhaps the most important for Aristotle, at least, and that's the formal cause. So the formal cause, I guess, is the structure. You could call it the blueprint or the design. In a sense, it's the essence of the object, and it's for Aristotle, I guess the formal cause is that is what has to be there, what draws all the other causes together in order to make an object what it is. And lastly, is the final cause. Now this one's very counterintuitive to how we understand causality. The final cause, I suppose, is what is known as the telos. The final cause is usually referred to as the purpose or the goal, or maybe the direction or the tendency or the disposition. So in another sense, I guess, is the possibility, which runs counter to how we understand causality, or how we understand causality in terms of efficient causality, because you wouldn't really think about, if you're thinking about, why you're if you were doing a degree or something like that, right? So the final cause would be, your qualification, your degree at the end, and that would be sort of governed by the learning that you do in the interim. So the learning would be oriented towards the ultimate qualification, and the ultimate qualification is, although not present, is in some sense motivating the object or the being, if you want to put it in Heidegger's terms, or even indeed in Aristotle's terms. So those four things are important for Heidegger, because Heidegger's argument, I guess, is that we have forgotten about the other dimension of those other notions of causality, and we have become hyper focused on the notion of efficient causality, or instrumental causality, especially with regard to how we understand technology, and how technological objects or technological discourse or technological innovations emerge. Okay, so I suppose, in short, why Heidegger thinks this is important, why we should at least be thinking about Aristotle's four causes, is because, in some sense, what we've done is we've allowed ourselves to be overly determined by the efficient causality, and in a sense, by losing out a sense of the other forms of causality, we lose a sense of world. And, I think the example of material causality helps us there, so I'm working on a computer now, yet I've, no idea of how the materials are arranged in order to make all of this happen, or to communicate through you, or to record this video, right? And in a sense, I've lost I've lost the sense of the world that is made manifest through the object, through the tool that I have in front of me, say my computer. And I think that's the main thing. If you can think about that what technology does is, especially technology as it's given over to nihilism, what it does is it creates, it diminishes the sense of place and world. Okay, now that's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'll get onto that at the end. But I suppose, as we saw in the essay on the thing with Heidegger, that that what modern technology is doing is creating a sense of placelessness, or a lack of a proportionate sense of world. We're becoming worldless. I guess a good example of this might be, say, something like Skype. So we think like that Skype, or Microsoft Teams, or any of these things, we think that what they do is they bring people together, but in a sense what they're doing is they're actually separating us and removing us. And I suppose ultimately what they're doing for Heidegger is they are leveling, and that's the nihilistic dimension of this. They're sort of modern technological devices are leveling our sense of world, our sense of where we are, our sense of locale, even if you like. And why is that? Well, it's because, the world is in some sense shrinking. It's becoming more and more homogeneous. So, if I have a Skype with, say, someone in, I don't know, Australia, that sense of distance is starting to be lost, and therefore with it we lose a sense of place. Okay, so I'm going to try and talk a bit through the themes now of what Heidegger is driving at in the essay and the question concerning technology. I suppose one of the places, the useful place to start thinking about this is in our common distinction between art and craft. So we can say there's a distinction between, say, something like fine art and roughly the mechanical arts. So say we might call, say, something like carpentry or block laying a craft, whereas we would call, I guess, fine art would be, say, something like, that Leonardo da Vinci does, right? And in a sense, what that everyday sense of usage we have denotes for Heidegger is that, craft art becomes geared towards the functional and the instrumental, and maybe the ornamental, whereas fine art demands a higher level of specialization and a higher level of skill. I think a really good example of this is like in the Renaissance period, when people were parts of guilds, it was often the case that fine artists, your Michelangelos and your Leonardo da Vinci's, would have been part of the same guild as, the people who come and paint your wall, right? Or a sculptor might be in the same guild as, say, a stonemason, because both were people who worked with craft and art. And in some sense, what we've done is we've divided those two meanings, or they become hyper specialized. So the carpenter does carpentry, and the fine artist draws murals on walls, or draws the Mona Lisa, or whatever. But I think in some sense what's going on with Heidegger is that he's lamenting that split, the split between technical art and fine art. And in a sense, what he's trying to do is he's trying to try to cure of us of the thinking that split has merged. Because if we think of craft as just something utterly functional, then we just think of it as geared towards the production of objects. So, the carpenter will fix your door, hang your door, or whatever, and that is just what the carpenter does, and the fine artist will draw a painting for you. But in a sense, Heidegger thinks we've lost something profound in separating art and craft. And I think this is where we come on to the questions of Tecna and poiesis for Heidegger. Now, so how do I explain this? So I suppose the thing to understand is, again, this all relates to what we were talking about last week, that the question of art is linked to the question of creation, and the question of creation is therefore about the question of being and the question of truth. And in a sense, technology, what it does more than anything for Heidegger is that it is a mode of truth, or it is a mode of revealing. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that in some sense our relationship with technology reveals the world to us. It reveals the world to us in particular ways. And what Heidegger thought was, and he's sort of going back to the ancient Greeks here, he thought this distinction between art and craft, or Tecna and what's called poiesis, is, I suppose, to be lamented. Right? In some sense, it's really important for our understanding, our thinking, and for understanding how truth unfolds in the world, that we think of Tecna and poiesis as, well, as not separate, actually, as two sides of the same coin, if you like. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. So poiesis, well, poiesis refers to, we see it. Poiesis refers to poetry, roughly. Now we think of poetry as a very specific type of activity. And Heidegger loved poetry, and he wrote poetry, and he thought sort of poets were, sort of the best poets, I suppose, were those who took their poetry beyond just the mere craft of its production, and thought poetry as a way of revealing the nature of being, or revealing how historicality emerges. And so poesis, I suppose, is Heidegger's effort to try and overcome the separation between creation, or being, and art and production. So poesis itself is the old Greek word for to make, and it's also the root of our poetry. And I think what Heidegger is basically asking us to think of is asking us to think of making, or the production of technology, in a more poetic or creative way. I think the etymology is useful in helping us understand what he's getting at. And poesis sort of means production, means creation. It means making as well. It means it contains a technical aspect, but it's what it's about for Heidegger. And for Heidegger, poesis is a type of thinking about technology that's geared more towards, I suppose, sustaining the world, or supporting it, or keeping it going, or bearing it forward. That is, it's geared towards sustaining creation, rather than, I suppose, for Heidegger, modern technology, which tries to dominate or subordinate the world, where production and making is always geared towards efficiency and profit, irrespective of the affect it will have on the world. Irrespective of the effect it will have on the world. So ultimately, I suppose what's going on here with Heidegger is, with our modern instrumental, efficient, causal understanding of technology, we have a question of creation versus destruction. Is the technology we use geared towards the sustaining of the world, the sustaining, I suppose, of nature in some sense, or is it geared towards destruction? Or is it geared towards engaging in unsustainable technical activity which undermines, or ultimately destroys, firstly thinking, and secondly the world itself? Okay, now that's roughly what poesis is driving at. The next question I guess I want to sort of talk to you about, the next sort of, the other side of that kind, is Tecna. And Tecna is, I suppose Heidegger is saying that, as we said, truth is something very dynamic and historical and emerging. And Tecna is, it's for Heidegger's related to, I suppose, temporal questions. Is the idea that we have to understand the world as it's happening, as it's occurring in process, rather than understanding technology as something that is preordained, mechanical, predetermined. All right, and in some sense, the question of truth is really important for Heidegger. Again, I always say that Heidegger is not a relativist. I mean, there's a sophisticated, worked out theory of truth going on in Heidegger, but truth is something quite dynamic for him. And Tecna then is about Tecna, or trying to think Tecna and poesis simultaneously, is about understanding that our technological objects, the technology that we see around us, the technology that we use in our everyday lives, is open, unfinished, is creative, is operating in tandem and alongside the world, rather than, I suppose, separate or abstract, or moved away from the world. Tecna is roughly the ancient Greek word for craft. So as I said, while we separate art and craft now, I suppose, in our thinking, Heidegger thinks instead that Tecna and poesis are intimately linked. And if poesis is the idea that technology ought to be geared towards sustaining creation, Tecna is the sense that I suppose we ought to think of our technology as related to the worlds in which we inhabit. Technology should be more geared towards something more enduring, something more that has a transitive sense, and by that I mean technology should be more geared towards maintaining a sense of our world, and a sense of our world as having a past, a present, and a future. So if you think about it, I was trying to think of examples of this part recording. I suppose a good example would be like, you take something like wood, right? So we make, say, wooden shelves, and wood is quite enduring as a material, right? Now I know people will say, well, we overuse wood and sort of rainforests and all that, but in some sense, if you make, say bookshelves, I'm looking at some right now, they last a long time. They're more enduring, and if you buy it, you don't have to replace it, right? All things going well, and maybe your house burns down, you might have to buy a new set of wooden shelves or something like that. However, that runs in opposition, or runs counter to modern technology, where the technological items we used are, well, they're disposable, they're transient, they're throwaway. And I think that's really what Heidegger is trying to get us to do. He's trying to get us to think about how technology makes us think. Right? He's trying to think of technology as something that I suppose is more productive and enriching if it's oriented towards creating something more durable or enduring, and that contains more a sense of our world. Our technology should be geared towards sustaining or sheltering humans. He speaks in those types of language for Heidegger, sheltering humans from past to present to future. And the danger with modern technology is that it does not have this capacity. Modern technology, I suppose, ultimately for Heidegger is nihilistic, because what it does is it atomizes us, it separates us, and it removes us from the world in which we're engaged, the world in which we're involved, or the world in which we dwell or inhabit. Okay, so ultimately, I suppose what's going on there for Heidegger in some sense is that, I suppose, with the example of the carpenter or carpentry or wood, in some sense, that Tecna, that is the production of wood, is more attuned to the world in which it inhabits. It's not setting demands on the world. It's not excessively demanding on the resources in which we find in the world. So, my wooden bookshelves, for example, they'll last a long time. Whereas if I get some, cheap bookshelves, it's quite likely in a short space of time they will disintegrate, or I will need to replace them. I suppose another good example of this would be the idea of built-in obsolescence into smartphones, in some sense that these are made to be broken, and these phones are in some sense made to be to wear down after a short period of time, in order that we have to buy new ones, and therefore set further demands upon the world, right? So it's a good example, actually, even more so, because it goes back to the idea of causality. Who knows how their phone works? Who knows about the materials, where they come from, what minds they come from, what political configurations, what inequities go into the manufacture of the very smartphones which network us all together. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, another key point in Heidegger's essay on the question concerning technology, then, this is about the idea of modern technology, or contemporary technology, if you want, or the technology that we are existing in. And remember, if we're talking about Aristotle, we talked about the efficient causality, instrumental causality. So what Heidegger is saying is that what Heidegger is saying, it seems to me, is that with modern technology, we are so given over to understanding causality in terms of the efficient cause, that what we've done is we only ever can think in instrumental terms. We only can ever think in mechanical terms. And what's ultimately happening, I suppose, for Heidegger is that what modern technology is doing is it's mechanizing us, right? It's transforming what we are. And that's what's ultimately happening in the essay, in the question concerning technology. In a simple sense, in science, sci-fi sense, we are becoming machines. So rather than us determining the relationship with our technological objects that we use, and again, we have to be careful here. Heidegger is not saying technology is necessarily a bad thing. In some sense, technology is fundamental. I mean, we are technological beings. We are tool users. That distinguishes us in many ways, and it defines and brings proportion and shapes the world in which we inhabit. So we use tools. But his concern, I suppose, is that this mechanized thinking, this instrumental thinking, the ultimate endpoint of that is that we will mechanize ourselves to such a degree that we become part of well, as I say here on the slide, a wider apparatus, what he calls das Gestell, or the framework is what it's translated, or in some sense, the idea is, the other point I have there is the word that's used in translation is inframing, right? Inframing the world. So technology is bringing about a metaphysical transformation in how we think, and we start to think in more mechanized ways, we start to think in more mechanical ways, we start to think in more instrumental ways. I mean, if you want to put it in sort of trite terms, we become mere cogs in the machine. Right. Now, if you look at the top left there, I have a phrase there called networked thinking. Network thinking. Now, that's not really a word I think that Heidegger would use, but I just think it's instructive to helping us think about what he's driving at. Now, it's interesting this, right? Heidegger is talking about this idea of inframing. I mean, the question concerning technology, it was in the 60s, so this is long before the internet. This is long before, it's long before even we had the advanced telephone communications that we have now. It's long before modern media. It's long before the idea that it's long before the idea that that technology connects the globe, right? That's what I'm trying to get to. That's what I'm trying to say. I was searching for the right word there, and ultimately, I suppose that's what Heidegger's concern is. There's technology is kind of like a runaway train, right? It's going to dominate the whole world, and what is ultimately going to bring about is, Heidegger prophesies, I suppose, a form of networked thinking. Network thinking, that we are all some kind of nodes, atomized, separate, yet in some sense connected yet disconnected at the same time in this global phenomena, right? You might, I suppose it's very natural for us to think that, but you might say that the internet might be something like that, right? So the idea there then, this idea of das Gestell, is that we are becoming networked beings, or that's how that's how I'm trying to explain what Heidegger is driving at, that in some sense we are allowing ourselves to become enmeshed in instrumental thinking, mechanical thinking, to such a degree that we are becoming machines ourselves. Okay, so I suppose a good example of this, I think, is the movie Fight Club. Now, if you watch the movie Fight Club, I think it was a David Fincher movie. It must be nearly 20 years old now, or just shy of 20 years. But in that movie, there's a scene in it where the Edward Norton character stands in his living room, and he's alienated from the technologies and the life that he's become accustomed to, and he ultimately sort of says something to the effect of, I can't remember precisely, but he says something to the effect of, sometimes there's a scene where he's just kind of looking around his apartment, and he's looking at all the costs of all the objects in the apartment and how they are and how they affect him. And I suppose what he's saying is that the things we own, the tools we use, right, start owning us, start determining what we are, start transforming how we think, start setting us forward in very, very particular channels, and accommodating us with very, very particular and limited dispositions, and ultimately dispositions that are not attuned to the world we inhabit. And in some sense, ultimately for Heidegger, that creates a deficit of meaning, that creates a deficit of purpose, that creates a deficit of, well, it creates a deficit of possibility. The idea that I am nothing other than this machine, this piece of technology, right? I am nothing other than the paths that are opened up to me by the technological object that I'm using. And ultimately, as well, for Heidegger, what's happening there is that we are turning into what's called a standing reserve. And what technology, or the rapidity of instrumental technology, what it's doing for Heidegger is that it's turning us into what he says a standing reserve, right? And again, this is an unusual term, I guess, but what he's saying is that what we're doing is we're understanding the world and humanity and the objects and nature in it. We understand them as an inventory, a standing reserve, as in something that we put aside, something that we hold back, like a store or a stockpile, which we inventorize, or which we treat as an inventory, right? And what modern technology is doing, because it's a form of revealing, is that it reveals the world in very peculiar ways, or very specific ways, and it reveals the world as that's something that's there to be stored, to be circulated, to be exchanged, to be replicable, and ultimately to be exploited. And again, Heidegger is saying, well, what is the ultimate consequences of this? What are the ultimate consequences of this? This brings about a metaphysical transformation. So it transforms what we are. It transforms what we are. And ultimately, I suppose, it transforms us into mechanical beings. Now, I think a really good example of this is Heidegger talks about the dam on the Rhine, the hydroelectric plant, right? And he says, and if you look at this quote here, the hydroelectric plant is set into the current of the Rhine. It sets the Rhine to supplying its hydraulic pressure, which then sets the turbines turning, and this turning sets these machines in motion, whose thrust sets going the electric current, which allows the power station. Its network of cables are set up to dispatch electricity. The energy concealed in nature is unlocked, and what is unlocked is transformed. What is transformed is stored up. Stored up is in turn distributed, and what is distributed is switched about ever anew. Okay, I'll leave it there. But what Heidegger is driving at there is that the dam on the Rhine does. I suppose there's two things there. What it does for Heidegger is it's about mastery of nature. It's about ownership of nature. It's about the domination of nature. And that's when I say nature, I mean that Aristotelian sense of it's not just about sort of biological processes, right? It's not just about the environment. It's about what this massive object on the Rhine does. This dam on the Rhine, what does it do? It stores up water. It treats nature's energy as something that is disposable, something that is instrumental, something that is there to be used, that we can only treat as a form of utility. And I guess for Heidegger, that is a dangerous form of thinking, or a corrosive form of thinking, perhaps. The other point, I suppose, for Heidegger is that what it does is it brings about a type of thinking where we think of nature as inexhaustible, as infinite, as an infinite reservoir, as always there, something we can dip into, right? And in a sense, we think that the electricity that is generated from the dam on the Rhine is, well, it's ultimately without end. We never have to worry about this running out, and therefore, because it brings about the illusion of that type of thinking, I suppose. It brings about a form of artifice, and that artifice allows us to think that electricity is an infinite resource rather than a finite resource. Famously, Heidegger talks about sort of more conventional bridges in some of his work, and the traditional bridge is not as dominating, it's not as commanding, it isn't turning nature into a standing reserve, it isn't turning nature into or isn't turning, say in this instance, the river into something that we can stockpile, right? It has a more appropriate relationship with the world around it. It's more in tune or more in accord with its environment. Now, then, because of the idea of the framing, and because of the idea of standing reserve, Heidegger says it brings about very limited forms of thinking. Now, again, Heidegger is not saying rational thinking or instrumental thinking is necessarily bad in of itself. He just thinks it's very, very narrow, and it would be, wouldn't it? Like, it's just a form because it's just a form of it's geared towards the instrumental. It's just geared towards the useful, or what he calls the serviceable, where we think something is only of value if it works. If something is only of value if it's useful. Now, you might think, well, okay, something is valuable if it's useful. Of course it is. A carpenter hangs my door. That skill is useful. I need to have my door hanged so the wind doesn't come into my house, or I don't get burgled, or whatever. But in another sense, the best things in life, I suppose, are not necessarily useful. The best things in life are useless. They're done for their own sake. I know you might think here of, well, art would be a good example here. It might not necessarily bring about anything productive, but I guess for Heidegger, you have to balance the instrumental and useful and utility and the rational with a broader sense of the world. Because if we don't, our technology makes our thinking more calculative. It makes it more obsessed with, I suppose, efficiency, flexibility, innovation. Now, the question then is, if that's the type of thinking, what then is Heidegger's type of thought? That's what's happening ultimately. Heidegger is saying that that technology, or modern technology, is in some sense transforming the ways we think, and it's unbeknownst to us. I think his point is that modern technology is generating nihilistic forms of thinking. All right. So ultimately, as a philosopher, Heidegger's response then is, what forms of thinking need we engage in order to try and combat this form of thinking? And in a sense, there's a couple of things that we can say here. And I said at the outset of the lecture, only a God can still save us for Heidegger. Only a God can still save us. So the idea there for Heidegger is that we're quite pessimistic. I suppose he thinks maybe perhaps the danger is that we're too far gone, that technology has changed us so much and in such potentially destructive ways that we can no longer see past that. We can no longer see what we have become. But Heidegger, I suppose, he still thinks in the question concerning technology, he says a saving power can grow. And what are the types of features of that then? Well, I've got a few things here. In some sense, he has this word called Gelassenheit, and another awkward word to translate. It's usually translated as letting be, and letting be implies a sense of not just to leave nature alone, but to, I suppose, I can't say coexist with nature, but I suppose exist in a sense attuned to nature or to being. Or to understand, by that I mean as well the sense that we have to understand how our technological objects exist in the world in which they inhabit, that they're not divorced from their materiality, that they're not divorced from their essence, that they're not divorced from their purpose. All right, there's often when we talk about Gelassenheit, I think there's a temptation in the scholarship. Other Heideggerians might disagree with me, but they would say perhaps that Gelassenheit is, I don't know, it's like going on a picnic or going fishing or something like that. That's not necessarily the case. Gelassenheit is about responding to the events in an appropriate, attuned and responsive way, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be, just sort of peaceful activities. It could indeed, it could be violent activities. I think the philosopher Robert Bernasconi, for example, sort of a very significant Heideggerian, says that, he said that, like, for Heidegger, T.E. Lawrence was a really good example of it, Lawrence of Arabia, and he thought he would be a good example of Gelassenheit. And he sort of, Lawrence was well, he was quite militaristic. I'll just leave it at that for now. You can look him up, or watch the David Lean movie to get a sense of it. The other point, I suppose, with Gelassenheit is that there is a sense of, there might be sort of a sense of a custodial sense. We have to try to get back to having a sense of where we belong and the tools, or how the tools which we use are enmeshed in the world we inhabit. Right? And in a sense, when I say the word custodial, I don't mean that we have to become, the masters of nature. Heidegger, I think, would want to avoid that sense, but in some sense that we are, I suppose, it's hard to say this in English, I suppose, co-creators with alongside nature. The other question, which is a question that was always known as a very important for understanding Dasein, is the idea of finitude. Now, normally with Heidegger we talk about finitude as the sense of death, and death is that thing which individuates us in being and time, and finitude is a sense of our own mortality. But in another sense, that links to the question of standing reserve. If we have a sense of finitude, or a sense of the appropriate limits, or the sense that the world we inhabit can come to an end, then we have to try to have a sense of appropriate limits. We have to have a sense that the world is not inexhaustible, that it's not infinite, that it is not something that can necessarily go on forever. And then, the bottom point there is the word is openness, is slightly out of the frame. And I suppose for Heidegger there, the point is that Gelassenheit is having a sense of the not yet with regard to our technological being. A sense of potentiality, or a sense that the world can still become something other than what it is. For Heidegger, this would run counter to the idea of sort of the rampant industrial mechanized sense of instrumentalism that modern technology gives us, and that's the sense that Gelassenheit stands in opposition to the sense that that nature is dominated, or we're governed absolutely by necessity, or that we're predetermined. Having a sense of the not yet is having a sense that the world can be other than it is, or that the world can emerge alongside, that we can emerge alongside with the world as it occurs. Because the thing with calculative thinking is it's very mechanical, it's rational, it's instrumental. Everything's preordained in advance. We are on this path and we can go on no other. So in a sense, I suppose that's Heidegger's point, that sort of Gelassenheit is ongoing openness and challenging of the existing technological framework which dominates our life. So in summary then, the basic theme of what we've talked about with Heidegger is that he's not really worried about technology that is embedded in this world, that's related to this world, that exists alongside nature and the environment and has an appropriate sense of being, but he is concerned about the acceleration of modern technology and the consequent changes it brings about for our type of thinking, because modern technology has a profound capacity to be nihilistic, and that's because it is largely material and largely instrumental. So the greater the proliferation of technology, the more we become reliant on technology, the greater our need for consumption. And therefore, the more we become seduced by just material culture. We become seduced by the idea of reducing everything to just, say, materialism. Not necessarily materiality, but materialism, or consumerism maybe might be another word for it. And that means that we think of everything as useful, instrumental, and consumable. And ultimately for Heidegger, that's what's nihilistic. That is the production of nothing, or the production of technologies that are destructive to our being in the world and do not raise fundamental questions about who we are, where we are going, or where we come from. If we do that, then for Heidegger, we're given over to sort of in framing thinking, or das Gestell, or being networked, or having a network sense of humanity. And that's problematic for Heidegger because it creates humans that become more and more objectified. We become more and more turned into things. And it creates the danger that we understand human beings as mere instruments. And you could say that Dasein then becomes, in that sense, then becomes more and more understood in calculative and quantitative terms. And there, the danger there is that humans become more and more interchangeable, mechanized and diminished in some way, I think. If you like, we're becoming less real. And technology, Heidegger's concern is that technology is dictating to us what we are without even us realizing it. And it is thus consequently changing our humanity in very different ways. Now, a Marxist might disagree with that because Marxists tend to have more optimistic views of technology and how it can liberate us and reduce alienation and so on. But that's something I think you should probably think about as well. Are there more optimistic ways we can think about technology? That's something. Is Heidegger excessively pessimistic? That's something you can think about. Maybe bring to the seminar. So if you like, then, as I said, technology makes us less and less real, less and less connected to the idea that Tecna is a sense of the Tecna and poiesis together give us a sense of the world as it's happening, right? On the other hand, if we were given over to instrumental thinking or technological thinking, and he says the essence of technology is nothing technological, then for Heidegger that changes us. It changes how the world appears to us, and it therefore leads to a change in what we are as humans. And the ultimate consequence of that, I suppose, is that we lead to greater cultural homogeneity. Things become more and more the same. There's a great levelling or a hollowing of meaning and distinction, a loss of a sense of place, and the sense that objects and tools and the world we inhabit no longer matters. And that's ultimately, I suppose, what modern technology does, or that's the problem we're facing with it. It gives us the illusion of connection with others, and ultimately leads to a separation from our sense of self and the others. And then, in turn, of course, Heidegger in the end will say, a saving power grows, he says. So, he's not entirely pessimistic. I think he thinks we can, if we think in appropriate ways, if we think with a sense of Gelassenheit, letting be, with a sense of having the appropriate limits, if we think with a sense of openness, if we allow ourselves to hear the world as it is, to be present to the world as it's happening, then we can start to think in ways that are not nihilistic.